faces in this shul with the young boy. Our mitzvahs, we got simchas here. Welcome back. Thank you. Shul looks amazing. Welcome. I hear you're here 2 years. Good.
Good afternoon. Welcome. We're glad you're here to honor and celebrate the life of Eve Mazer. For those who just came from the funeral, welcome back. For those who weren't at the funeral, welcome nonetheless. We're glad you're here and to celebrate the life of a man that has done a lot for our synagogue, a lot for our community. One of the conversations that Jay and I have been having over the last couple weeks, and that I say often, is one of the things we say when we remember a loved one is Tzurura nishmato b'tzurura b'tzurura chaim. May his soul be bound up in the bonds of life. And to me, part of what that means is as we've had experiences, as we've had interactions, as we've built relationships and lived our lives, our souls get intertwined with those of others along the way. And so that even after we die, and even after we pass, there's a piece of that soul that still is intertwined with those around us. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to invite people, if you have a story, feel free to, we'll give you some space in a few moments to come up and share your story. You may just want to introduce yourself as you come up, but share what Eve meant to you and how he affected you in your life along the way. So that we can give you a little time to think about that, we'll first invite Honey to come up to share a few words in Eve's memory.
I will always have that wink as I pulled your sweater around you and gave you a kiss on the cheek. A few weeks later, things would change, as they often do. Your soul would ascend to where those who have gone before you are. Uncle Eve, you are a quiet man with a very big presence. And then that phone call came, the one you know before you know. A heart simply feels it, the heavy blanket of sorrow. Even with that darkness, there is light in saying goodbye. I believe that. I believe there is light in that there is no more furrowed brow or discomfort. Your body is resting now. Your essence remains here in each of us, that knew you, and each of us who love you. That part is reflected in how we live our lives now and each tomorrow. Eve Mazer had a quiet life that touched so many people in his 96 years. Not only did he love the Jewish community, but the greater community as well. He listened to you when you spoke to him. He was ready with thoughtful advice or jokes. I wasn't just Honey to him or Honey Beth. I was Honey Bet, want to make a bet. Or I was the one who got tickled when I was sitting quietly at the table. I did not learn until recently several things about Uncle Eve. He was an extremely well-read man. His book collection was filled with not only Jewish literature and prayer books going all the way back into the mid-1920s, but he studied history, mythology, and a host of nonfiction books. He was an avid handball player at the JCC. From a young age, he studied Judaism and continued to do so throughout his life. He cared for so many and guided so many during the hardest days of their lives. When each of my parents died, he was there. One time I even asked my dad, what do I do? What do I do if you or mom died? Dad said, don't worry. Ethan JB will help you. And they did, and he did. After my folks died, Steve and I would find ourselves having regular visits with Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve. Those were wonderful visits. Holidays and Shabbat tables were spent at their and Aunt Lynette and Uncle JB's homes. The beautiful tables that we enjoyed for a majority of my life slowly began to fold. Tablecloths and china, dishes, and crystal were put away. We did our best to adjust to this change. We shared smaller meals for a while, and then that was over. For 96 years, he, Uncle Eve, was a presence. Even in silence, that presence was there. That gentle, honorable presence has said goodbye. May your memory be a blessing and comfort to us all.
Now I'd like to open it up to all y'all. If there's anybody who would like to share a story, a memory, a lesson, a way that Eve affected you in your life, I'll invite you to come up and share that story with us now. Don't be shy.
Okay, I didn't plan anything, but I'm sitting here, and Eve and JB and Saul and the Fagelson cousins, Jean and Charlie, and all those boys, I can see them sitting at our great-grandfather Michael's house, beat up from their football or basketball games, but as I told my community last week, you still had to show up for shul on Saturday morning. So I just feel like a lot of, Uncle Eve is like the last of this gang. And I just couldn't let this pass without us saying hello to all of them here today. And remember, we were talking about with Billy, just, the seats, right? You had the Kimmerlings, and then you had the Mazers, and then you had the Fagelsons, and it went on and on, and some of us are here today, and it's great that we're all here, but I don't have an Uncle Eve story other than all the jokes and laughs and good times that he had with his cousins and his brother, and all the joy he brought to all of us. So, Aunt Frida, we miss him. He loved you very much, and we're glad you're here.
Anyone else want to share?
So I wasn't planning on it either, saying anything either, but so Uncle Leaf and Aunt Frida are as much my family as any of my family, and perhaps more so than much of my family that I'm related to by blood. My parents and Aunt Frida and Uncle Leaf were best friends, and I grew up in their house with them and Glenn and Jay and their dog Petey. And those were Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve. You can't say, it's like Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve, they go together. It's like one word, Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve, who, you know, even when my parents have gone, Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve have kept me going. They have remained my surrogate parents, along with others who I see here. And what Lily Kimmerling said, and by the way, I should have started this by saying that I am a Mazer Kimmerling wannabe. I really, between the Kimmerlings, the Mazers, the Fagelsons, that whole generation of people, and I look at their descendants, I look at their kids here who I grew up with, because, you know, Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve and Uncle JB and Aunt Lynette and Aunt Roz and Uncle Vic and Aunt Rita and Uncle Saul, and, you know, I could go on all day, Aunt Marcia and Uncle Wally and Aunt Frances and Uncle Alfred, and we all sat in our set seats, and this was the big block of Kimmerling, Mazer, and Fagelsons, and the Lapidus's always sit right there. Celia wanted to move a minute ago, and I said, "You cannot move. You cannot move." So I've always wanted to sit with the Mazers and Kimmerlings, but anyway. Uncle Eve was the funniest guy ever. One thing that I will say, that on Saturday nights, my parents and Uncle Eve and Aunt Rita would go out, and we would be asleep, the kids would be asleep, and all of a sudden, we start hearing some noise, and Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve and my mom and dad would all of a sudden show up, and we would wake up, and they would be so very happy. Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve and mom and dad were so happy on it. It's like, I didn't know anything about being shicker and all that. But my dad would play the piano. We'd all gather around. We'd sing while my dad playing the piano. But just getting back now, I could go on all day. And I wasn't planning to even get up here, but how can I not? I just see all these people I love, like right here, and especially Aunt Frida. But Uncle Eve, let me tell you a different side of Uncle Eve. He, like I said, a character. He was an uncle to us. He especially adored my little sister Celia, who he called Sillapoo. He was like his own daughter. But Uncle Eve did more for me in more recent years. We went through a bad period over a 10-year period where every other year we lost someone in my family. And Uncle Eve, it's like, who you going to call? You know, it was Uncle Eve you would always call. I remember being in my grandmother's apartment, and then through my parents and brother and son, it was always Uncle Eve you would call first to guide you, to hold your hand, to take you to Elmwood, to take you to John's Rideouts, to do everything and guide you. And he would be at every funeral with Keith, you know, Keith from Rideouts. And Uncle Eve, and I just swear today, I said to somebody, I see Uncle Eve here. I mean, Uncle Eve he should be running the show. How could we do this without him? In any event, he was always there for me, always leading Monday Morning Minion for years and years while I was there. And on behalf of my sisters, my whole family, we love you, Uncle Eve, and Aunt Frida. You will always be our Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve. We love you forever.
Invite anybody else who would like to come up to share a few words. You want to say something? You can come up and say something.
My name is Kaylee Levy. I am a Rathmel. And Frida, my mom and I came to visit you recently, you and Eve. And, I kept thinking to myself, I know this name, Eve Mazer, I know him. And my mom kept going on and on and on about how important Eve was to her. I'm sorry that she's not here today, because I know she would have wanted to share that they were on a board together, I believe, maybe through the JCC. while they were there to be volunteers and to serve the community, I don't think they realized they were going to strike up such a wonderful friendship, and I know he meant a lot to her. And I will always have very fond memories of Eve, because when I worked at the JCC at the front desk, when he would come in to play handball regularly, thank you, honey, for mentioning handball, because I thought he was part of the racquetball crew. He was always smiling, and he paused to say hello to me, and made me feel like I was seen, and that I wasn't just there to serve the community, but that he cared about me. So I didn't know Eve well, but he will forever be someone who I am fond of because he was so kind.
I really don't like speaking at family. Can you hear me? No? Okay. All right. I've never before spoken at a family event like this, so, but there are a couple of things I wanted to mention. So, Aunt Frida, you're an Uncle Eve's great-granddaughter, and Erica's baby, and Saul and Rita's great-grandson, Carla's baby, share a birthday, which was February 8th. Today is their birthday. I mean, their 8-month birthday, right? February 8th, 2024, right? So you have, I always love symmetries, and that's a symmetry. But what I wanted to say about Uncle Eve, and I was telling Jay and Brandon about this earlier, that, a lot of us here, I have two of my best high school friends are here, and all these people we grew up with, and a lot of you know what it's like to be a teenage girl in Birmingham, and what it was like for us. It's normal for teenage girls to feel badly about themselves. It's kind of a miracle if they don't feel badly about themselves. But when I think about Uncle Eve, I think of him as the person who, because of Uncle Eve, I did not have to feel bad about myself when I was a teenage girl growing up in Birmingham. Because whenever you saw him, he would say something that, whenever I saw him, he would say something that made me feel good about myself, and that was Uncle Eve, So I wanted to share that because that was what I was thinking of. And then, of course, so Glenn and Michael and Judith and I had a kind of reunion dinner last night, and obviously we were talking about a lot of family stories, and we all have so many memories and so many stories in our brains. And the conclusion I came to is that we can't really believe any of the stories that we heard from anyone because everyone's got a different story. So that was kind of interesting. But anyway, there are a lot of great memories that we all have. And I'll never forget Aunt Frida's tacos. That was like the highlight. One of the highlights of our childhood was going over to Aunt Frida and Uncle Eve's to eat tacos because she knew how to make tacos being from El Paso. So anyway, now that I've been living in California, I really appreciate your, that southwestern border culture element that you brought to Birmingham. So anyway, thank you. We love you.
Anyone else like to share?
I'm going to speak close to you because I want you to hear me. Can you hear me okay? I think back about all the occasions when you and Uncle Eve bar mitzvahs, Rosh Hashanah, and we were always so excited because you and Uncle Eve were the most amazing team, and we just loved you. We loved you. I couldn't imagine that I had always listened to Zadie's, you know, your dad's Yiddish. I never knew anybody could speak it with a southern twang until, you know, I was old enough to appreciate Birmingham Yiddish. And, but Aunt Freedy, you know, and then the summers we came here were amazing. And we got to know many of you. But it was as if we were with Mom and Dad. We came, we worked at the trash business in the summer. And I remember Uncle Eve, you know, things were tough down there. And we would get up early in the morning, and we would go down, Jay, and we would work, and Uncle Eve was to the task all day, all night. I remember through the bad weather, the trucks would break down, and he was relentless, and he was amazing. And I also remember the amazing Shabbosim we had with the Kimmerling, sitting with your, you know, with all the Mazer side of the family. Big table, you know, and Uncle Eve always being the center of whether we were talking about the Torah portion or the drush. And what I really remember most as a young boy is this intense love of Israel. Unconditional, no questions asked, you know. And he would sit and he would teach us about, you know, what it is to be a proud, you know, and practicing Jew. And I have all of those amazing and wonderful memories. And he was just bigger than life, and he was like my dad. I remember when we would be at a wedding or whatever, you were always there. You two were always there. And there would be Uncle Eve, my dad, Uncle Harris, and they were like, it was like cookie cutter. They were the same generation, the same greatness, the same, you know, Yiddishkeit, the same intense love of community and being a Jew. So, you know, Danny and I are very happy to be here, and we are honored that he was our uncle. How did we get so lucky? And about your tacos, so people, I'm going to make a correction. Her tacos are great because when Tante Fredenke was an infant, she came across the bridge from Juarez in a wagon with my Zadie and my other aunt and uncle, and they came. That's why her tacos are good, because that's, you know, that's our heritage. You know, they came from Mexico to El Paso, rescued by the JDC, right, and brought Rabbi Renoff, you know. So Aunt Freedy, it's a life, and we're here for you. God willing, we're going to get back up here to spend some time with you. And thank you for being here. Oh, love you so much, Aunt Freeda. I miss Uncle Eve.
And Frida, you know, it's Uncle Eve was, as you all know, I don't need to tell anybody here, was an amazing man. He had left a very indelible mark on our lives, being, you know, living, you know, 1,000 miles away from here. But one thing I cherish most is, as human beings, especially young men and grown men, we're very fortunate to see the same characters in an uncle as we do as our father. And so with Uncle Eve kind of was paramount to my dad. So we felt very blessed that, God forbid anything happened to my dad when we were young, before we're older adults and able to function on our own. We knew that we always had you all. And these memories we have were just absolutely amazing. Uncle Eve, you know, when I have overnights here with Southwest and y'all come pick me up, we would sit and have some of the most wonderful conversations about what a stark Zionist your dad was, and it's really inspirational, especially now. But my gratitude for the fact that this man reminded me so much of my own
think we have time for a couple more if anybody would like to share.
I had a very great many years with Eve when we talked about things that were important, things that my parents were doing that I didn't like, that he had to explain to me why I had to do it, why I couldn't go out on Friday night on dates. And he was sort of in between a big brother and another father. But he was always there, even the last minute when I was with y'all in your house 2 or 3 months ago. And I will never forget those moments. They were shared moments between us, but no one else. And he was a very good friend, and he was a cousin, and he and my dad were like this all the time, and it was wonderful. And it's just been a relationship for years and years that I will never forget, and I hope that we can replicate among our children. Now, Les, what do you want to say?
I'm Debbie's husband, Les Schneider, and I found that coming down from New York and marrying somebody from the South, let alone Birmingham, was, I thought, going to be a cultural shock. But I found that not only were my in-laws very nice to me, but all of the other relatives were equally as nice, especially Eve. And I can safely admit in front of all of you, I never beat him in handball. I never beat him in racquetball. Unfortunately, this family has too much talent in sports that I decided to become a lawyer because it was my only way out to any kind of victory. But I would often notice with Eve, and certainly Frida also, nothing I enjoyed more than hearing Frida say, J. Arthur Mazer, please come forward, and reprimand him about something or other, which is just how my mother would reprimand me. I had a lot of conversations with Eve over the years, and it was one in particular stands out. He and I were talking about the fact that so many of us, run for the dollar and, all worried about financial security, et cetera. And I remember telling Eve that my father told me a story that I was very avaricious when I was young, and one time my father was trying to break me of that habit, and he called me over and he said he was going to give me a quarter. And of course I went to grab for the quarter, and he goes, not so fast. He said, I want you to close one eye, which I did. And then he said, and I want you to take the quarter and put it right next to your other eye. And so I did. And my father said, what do you see? I said, well, I'm not stupid. I see the quarter. And he says, all right, now hold the quarter out. And he said, what do you see now? I said, well, I see the quarter, I see the people, I see the wall, etc. He says, well, that's the key to life. Don't put the quarter too close to your eye. And I remember Eve telling me, would you mind not telling that story to anybody else in Birmingham? Because I'd like to use it. And I said, my lips are sealed, you can have the story. And the greatest irony is when Debbie and I went out to visit Saul in Colorado, it was interesting because there was one day that Saul and I were alone, nobody else was there, and we were talking about grandchildren, children, the search for money or whatever, and Saul starts to tell me this story. And I figured, well, I'm going to act very surprised, like this is very unique. So obviously I knew Eve told that story to at least one person, so going there. But this was a man that was not only large in life, but he had a wonderful heart. He was very well read. You could have an argument with Eve without anybody taking it personally. He was very, very slow to anger, and even when he got annoyed at somebody, it seemed to me he always forgave them. And I think that's one of the things today is that, you know, everybody thinks they're right and everybody else is a cretin idiot. And I think that Eve was somebody who was anxious to have good quality debate without taking it personally. And I think that's one of the things I'll remember about him, as well as his kindness and his desire to live his life fully, but it was never all about Eve. It was all about everybody else and how much he cared about them. So we'll remember about that. So you see, it wasn't so bad to speak.
If anybody else would like to share, you're welcome to. And I'll invite Eve's son, Jay, to come up to share a few words in memory of his father.
Mom told me to talk loud. Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to briefly just talk about the origin of the name Ephraim. It's a masculine Hebrew name. It's typically pronounced Ephraim, Ephraim, Ephraim. I heard all these different names, and I heard Dad called all these different names, and he never corrected anyone. He answered to each and every one of them, which I was there. I said, why doesn't he? He says, as long as they keep calling me, that's all that really counts. The Hebrew meaning I've read recently was the definition is to be very fruitful and productive. Ephraim was the second son of Joseph and one of the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. But I want to share with you what Ephraim means to me and what so many of you have told me he means to you. He was my mentor and confidant. He was my oldest best friend. He was the most ferociously independent man I knew. His favorite 3 words, especially once he was sick, was, "I got it." God forbid you should try and help him. I often shared with the caregivers, I said, when you help Dad or you're walking him and shadowing him, don't put your hand on his back, because he will stop and he'll turn to you and he'll say, "I've got it." And if you do it a second time, I'm not quite sure what he's going to say to you, so please don't do it. He seemed to always be helping others, but never needing or asking for help. He was just a bit stubborn, which is an understatement. And although he never said this to me, I always heard it. He would say, "Be reasonable and do it my way." That was Dad. He had a great sense of humor, but his jokes were so corny. And we would shake our heads. It was, and say, you need new material. Corny jokes. He used to love, especially in a restaurant. I was so embarrassed when that waitress would come and he'd start joking and everything would fly over that waitress's head because she had no idea what he was trying to joke with her about. To give you an idea, just an example, and I've shared this with a few people. Do any of you know how to make egg roll? Obviously not many. Well, Dad would say, "You push it." Okay, that's what I'm talking about. He worked hard to provide for his family, very hard. Jerry shared that story with us, and he worked hard to provide for others. His desire to serve his Jewish community through his commitment to the Chevra Kadisha began in the 50s. As a kid and into my adult life, I remember the phone ringing at all hours of the night, and I would hear Dad telling the caller that all they needed to do was make the necessary arrangements with the funeral home, and he would handle everything else. I've lost count of how many people have come up to me over the years, even today, and told me and shared with me how important Dad was to them in getting them through the darkest times of their lives. I saw an email that went out prior to this Sunday from the head of the Chevra Kadisha to the members, telling them about Dad's Tahara and taking care of Dad and asking them to participate. And it said, "Our leader has passed away." I sat there with them, and they shared stories of how Mr. Mazur told me to stand right here and do this job and do it well and don't worry about what anybody else is doing. That's how he handled it. He trained them all, and it was so important to him to take care of this responsibility for his community. To be the son of parents as beloved as Mom and Dad fills me with incredible emotion. I don't have words for it. But to hear your folks talked about, like my parents are talked about in this community, and the Jewish community, and even outside of the Jewish community, it fills my heart. I can literally feel it. I can feel it. And don't think for 1 minute I lose sight of the fact that with all of Dad's accomplishments, Mom was right there with him. Dad would not have been Dad without my mother. And everybody knows that, Mom. We always talk about Dad, and Dad did this, and Dad did that, but you did it too. And he could not have accomplished that without you. There have been some difficult times over the last 7 years since Dad got sick. And there were things that took place, and you had to tell yourself, this is not Dad. This is an illness. This is not my father. Mom and I would have multiple conversations about it. We have to let that go, let it go. And it was difficult at the time, really tough at the time for Mom. But now, I think I mentioned it to Rabbi, that difficult time seems to have faded. It was 7 years, but it didn't sink into the brain. It was 7 years that were not the Eve Mazur that we know because of his illness. But the Eve Mazur that we all know and love is there and embedded in our brain. And that's the cream rises, if you will. That's the Eve Mazur that I remember, Mom remembers, and I hope obviously many of you remember. And that's critically important. I loved the experiences of seeing Mom and Dad together in these later years. Dad always took care prior to his illness. But the minute Dad got sick, the roles changed, and Mom had the responsibility. And she was like a bear with her cubs. She looked after him like no one else. Some of the special things, you see your parents working when we're younger in the hustle and bustle of life. You don't see them hugging or kissing that much. At least I didn't, but I knew they loved one another. But the last 7 years, I'd be pushing Dad into bed in his chair, and I'd stop. He'd want me to stop right in front of Mom's chair. She'd hold her hand out. He'd hold his hand out. They would kiss each other's hand. And good night, I love you, and off we would go. When there were a few experiences when Mom was in one hospital and Dad was in the other at the same time. And to listen to the two of them, how's Dad, how's Mom, what's going on? Neither one of them cared about their illnesses. They were just terribly concerned about how the other was doing. And then one time, they were in that same hospital at the same time, on the same floor, but at opposite ends. I mean, and I was able to wear out the tile. Mom wanted to go see Dad. Dad wanted to go see Mom. And they did. And it was a hug, a kiss, I love you too. I can't tell you how that restores your faith. In 75 years together, and they are loving and caring for one another the way they are and were. In the last couple of weeks, when Dad was able to talk, Maya's confirming. When Dad was able to talk, he would ask, how's your mother? Where's your mother? And when she would walk into the room and he'd hear her voice, he would light up, his eyes would light up, and it was a highlight for him. So I think it's important that you know that how I had the opportunity to tell Dad how special he was to me, how much I loved him, and how great a father he was. It was something that was important that I do. First of all, thank God I had the time to do it. And it was critically important that he knew it. And there isn't anything that I wish I would have said to him, because I had the time to think about everything that I needed to say. And I did. I got to tell him not to worry about Mom, that she was going to be fine. And life would go on, and he didn't have to worry. He'd taken care, he'd done enough. And in closing, I just want you and Dad to know how proud I am to be your son. If I were given the opportunity to choose my parents, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I love you, Mom, and I love you, Dad.
In a moment, we'll conclude the service, and then everybody's invited for a meal of consolation in the Cultural Center straight down that way. So I hope you'll join us and continue sharing stories and memories and lessons with the family, and continuing to provide them comfort. Before we do that, though, I'd like to invite those family who are able to rise. As we did graveside, we'll do the El Male Rachamim, the memorial prayer, followed by the mourner's Kaddish. El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bamromi, Hametzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tohorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirihi, Et Nishmat Ephraim ben Baruch Shlomo Shahalach La'olamo, B'gan Eden Tehe Menuchato, Ana Ba'ar Harachamim, Hastirehu Beseter Knefecha Lo'olamim, Utzror Bitzror HaChaim et Nishmato, Adonai hu nachalato. V'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo. Nomar Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, to the soul of Eve Mazer, who has gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. Now we'll conclude with the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shamei Rabbah, Be'alma divrach irutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, B'hagala u'vizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yitale v'yitalal Shmei d'kudsha b'richu. Le'ela le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba min Shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. That concludes our memorial service. Again, please join us for a meal of consolation in the Cultural Center. Feel free to stick around as the family will have a Shiva minyan for them at 5:30. We'll do mincha, and the family will be sitting the rest of this week, starting at 3:30, sitting Shiva here at Bethel, and then concluding with a mincha service each night at 5:30. On behalf of the family, thank you for being here to comfort them, and zichrono livracha. May his memory be a blessing.
Yes, sir. You're 20.
20 minutes to the airport? What's the traffic like?
Fine. Okay. You'll be fine.
All the feathers get off. I love that hat. I love
What time's your flight? Yeah, I mean, there's no lines. It's a smaller airport. Y'all should be fine.